Well, it has been a year since my father has passed, and while we gathered last spring to celebrate our father's life, I realized that we did not offer a eulogy to commemorate who he was. Time has a way of revealing what remains unsaid. Today, 1 year since his passing, I want to offer the words he deserves to commemorate our father, Thomas Scott. There is so much to say about someone who lived 88 years, and this is just a glimpse of the person that my father was. Dad grew up in Grand Falls, Newfoundland, and when he talked about his youth, it is obvious that he grew up in a world that seems very distant to what we know now. Here is just a few of the stories that he shared with us when he remembers those years so long ago. As a youth, Dad was very active with ball and hockey and many other sports. One time he said to me, we were never home, except for when we had to be, such as at mealtime or bedtime. We were outside all the time. I asked him, even in the coldest days of winter. Dad nodded and said that was the best hockey and skating weather. He added that Christmas was different because there were new things and sometimes visitors, and he was expected to be inside. It was clear that Dad grew up a very active and healthy youth, taking in as many sports and activities as he could be involved in. On that note, Dad often spoke about the religious tension in Grand Falls when he was a boy. He used to walk home from hockey with a friend who attended the Catholic school, but as they approached their houses, they would instinctively cross to opposite sides of the street. Neither of their families would have approved of their friendship. It's nice to think that, despite the rivalry their parents practiced, those two boys didn't see that divide in the same way. As a boy, for some reason, my father earned a reputation for breaking windows with rocks or baseballs. Whether he was guilty or not, the label stuck. Whenever a window broke, Dad was the immediate suspect. To pay for the damages, he began delivering hot lunches to mill workers for a nickel each. Over time, Dad's hard work paid off. Not only did he cover the cost of damages, but his reputation for vandalism eventually faded away. I'd like to believe that Dad was a good student, though he likely had moments when he wasn't. My father once told me about a high school teacher who tried to snuff out his ambition before it even started. When Dad went to pay the $5 fee for his final exams, the teacher told him he'd be better off saving his money for cigarettes. Clearly, he didn't think that Dad had much hope of passing. But that doubt was exactly the fuel my father needed. He passed his exams, driven by the goal of proving that teacher wrong, and I truly hope that he got the chance to savor that moment. One time, many years back, I sat in on Dad and his brother Les reminiscing about many stories of growing up in central Newfoundland. They revisited a day when they were young and both went blueberry picking, taking a single bicycle. After they had filled their bucket with berries, the two set off down a hill on the bike, as Dad pedaled and Les sat on the back seat. At some point, Les's feet got caught in the wheel, and the two of them went flying over the bicycle, and the blueberries spilled all over the hill. Dad and Les laughed as they recalled trying to catch the blueberries in the bucket as they rolled down the hill. Les said he was worried about returning home without a bucket full of berries, but Dad said he was more worried about Les's feet. That's the kind of big brother that he was. Dad grew up in a rather small house in Grand Falls, Newfoundland, with 3 other siblings and his cousin Millie. But in those days, Dad would often say when you reached 18, you left home. Both his brother Bill and sister Joyce were much older than Dad, so as he said, they left home. And when Dad was 18, he left home as well. So it probably wasn't as crowded as we might have believed. Like his older siblings, Dad left home just after high school and began a long and rewarding career in aviation that ranged from the cleaning and servicing of aircrafts to being the manager of the air traffic control towers in both Gander and St. John, New Brunswick. Throughout a career undoubtedly defined by numerous milestones, few moments would equal the intensity and significance of Dad's role in the negotiations with the hijackers of TWA Flight 355 in 1976. When the Boeing 727 transitioned from New York to a refueling stop in Gander, Dad became pivotal in the high-stakes negotiations. His composure and endurance led to the release of 35 passengers before the aircraft continued its journey across the Atlantic. In recognition of his dedicated service, Transport Canada later honored Thomas Scott with a special award of merit. I always saw my father as a very hard-working man, both at the airport and at home, and this was never more evident in the house that he built for us in Gander in the early 1970s. Dad turned a wooded lot on the side of a dirt road into a beautiful 2-story house which we called home for nearly 20 years. He cleared the land by hand, and once the main structure of the house was built, both he and my mother busied themselves with their own interior designs that included painting, wallpaper, stonework behind the wood stove, and other fine details. As kids, my sister and I knew very few Saturdays that did not involve going to the new house and watching our parents work tirelessly while we tuned in cartoons on an old black and white TV with rabbit ears. In subsequent years, I observed my father work about our house and property with fine precision, dedication, and pride. I know that watching my father take on so many home projects that his work ethic would rub off on me. I think about this whenever I take on my own home projects, and I can still remember my mother once commenting, "Your father never hired anyone. He did it all himself, and it was always perfect." Over the years, Mom and Dad often reminisced about their youth in the 1950s, the years they spent dating and their wedding in October of 1959. To hear them tell it, life then was pure and simple, defined by cool cars and rock and roll radio, decades before the era of cell phones and iPads. They often made reference to the road trip to Boston and New York shortly after being married. To them, these cities were places of mystery and intrigue that they had only ever seen in magazines or on television. They recalled how their Newfoundland license plate drew some curious onlookers, many of whom might have been both confused and fascinated by where they had come from. My father was a very good, if not an excellent, provider. Christmases, birthdays, and summer vacations were not without a bounty of gifts, food and drink, and plenty of good cheer. But I think that my sister and I would have to agree that perhaps the most unique experience we shared as a young family was when Dad piled us into a 1970s station wagon and began a week-long trek that took us from central Newfoundland to Orlando, Florida. Looking back, it's ironic that Dad worked so closely with the aviation industry, and yet he drove us 4,000 kilometers into another country so that we could see what all the fuss at Disney World was about. We explored many places in Florida and then set out for the long ride back home. We couldn't wait to get our films developed and relive that family adventure. In 1989, Dad left the tower in Gander and took on a new role as manager of the St. John Tower. He worked in New Brunswick for just a few short years before retiring, and then Mom and Dad spent many of their post-retirement years in their winter home in Florida. For roughly 20 years, Mom and Dad packed their car to the roof with their essentials and took off to the Sunshine State to enjoy the winter months with warmth and sandy beaches. It wasn't uncommon for my mother to hold Christmas Day in late November, complete with turkey dinner, Christmas tree, and gifts, because they were leaving the next day for the U.S. During their years in Florida, they enjoyed numerous cruises and other festivities. Dad often commented as they were packing their winter essentials, "Sorry, son, we won't be around this Christmas, but truth be told, we can't wait to go." As a youth, sometimes it was obvious that my father and I occupied different worlds. His interests fell towards athletics, and mine were more in music and the arts. Yet our worlds came together one night when I was just a boy, and he brought me to the hockey arena to watch him play a game. I remember the dank smell of the stadium and the sound of skates carving into the ice as I watched from the bleachers. Dad was on fire that night, racking up goals one after the other, perhaps 3 or 4 before the end of the first period. When he finally came off the ice, I told him I couldn't believe how many points he'd scored. He didn't boast about his skill. Instead, he gave me a memory I've kept forever. "That must be because you're here," he said. While my father had always been involved in sports like hockey and baseball, even serving as a swimming instructor, his athletic journey took a new turn when we settled in Gander. Following in my mother's footsteps, who had been involved for a few years, Dad decided to try his hand at curling. He took to the ice with remarkable ease, transitioning from a novice to a competitive skip in just a few years. Though the dream of reaching the Brier and appearing on the national stage remained just out of reach, he became a respected challenger at the Gander Curling Club. For my parents, that curling club was more than just a sporting venue. It was the heart of their social world, a place where many friendships were made and many good times were had. Dad's love of sports was obvious when he offered to umpire his granddaughter's softball games in Nova Scotia. He went as a spectator, but when they called for volunteers, Dad was quick to put up his hand and offer assistance. He loved that. If there was one thing that truly bonded my father and I, it was our passion for motorcycling. I grew up mesmerized by the various machines that he brought home, so it was only natural that I'd eventually have one of my own. When my family lived in Gander, I often rode my motorcycle back and forth from university in St. John's. One day as I motored back home, I barely stepped inside when Mom asked if I had seen Dad on the highway. I had not. It turns out he had left on his own motorcycle to meet me. He pulled into the driveway a short time later and said that he'd spotted me on the highway, but by the time he'd turned his bike around to catch up, I was already a speck on the horizon. I guess I rode a lot faster in those days. My mother later remarked that while my sister and I often saw her as the worrier of the family, it was sometimes Dad who was quietly keeping watch over us. "He'll be fine," my mother had said that day, but Dad couldn't sit still, so he took to the highway to meet me. Then a few years later, while riding from Newfoundland to meet my parents in New Brunswick, it came as no surprise that somewhere between Moncton and Sussex, I saw, on the opposite side of the highway, the familiar red Honda Interstate and white helmet that were unmistakably Dad's. We each found an exit from the highway and were soon greeting each other before finishing the journey to Rothsay. As my sister and I grew up, we always felt that Dad's word was the law. He seemed to have the final word on everything. My sister and I didn't just respect his opinions, we accepted them as gospel. And it wasn't until we reached adulthood that we dared to whisper the impossible. Dad might have actually been wrong once or twice. It was a bit of a shock to the system, a shift in how we saw the world. We eventually traded our childhood hero for a human father, one who could be imperfect or occasionally mistaken, but all the more relatable for it. In his later years, I saw a side of my father that I didn't always see growing up. My father was always a kind and giving man, but it wasn't until my mother's illness that I saw the full extent of his heart. Her well-being became his sole mission. Watching him stay by her side every day in those final years revealed a side of him deeply dedicated and fiercely loving. That I will never forget. One last memory that I would like to share is perhaps the final conversation that my father and I had a little over a year ago when he was in hospital. We had grown quiet and I was getting ready to head home to New Brunswick for a few days. Out of nowhere he asked, "Would you take Kitty home?" "Yes," I replied. "I will take Kitty and give her a good home." A moment later, a very gentle and lovely smile formed on his face. I knew he had been thinking about Kitty, and now he was sure that she was going to stay in the family. That contented look on his face is also something I will never forget. There is so much more that could be said about our father, but I think this paints a very clear image of who he was and the father that he became. Our photos and memories are all that we have left now, and we will cherish them for many years to come. Thank you.